So I'm going to go ahead and just get right into it with our first question. And with this first question, I want each of the panelists to reflect a little bit on their backgrounds. So Janet, I will start with you. And the question I have is, what does inspiring inclusion mean to you, particularly as you reflect on your career?
Certainly. Well, of course, I've been in a field much of my life that hasn't been fully represented with women and many other groups. To me, the most important thing is an attitude of openness and humility. I feel that so many people bring unconscious biases to their assessment of others, and to bring an attitude of humility, that I don't know everything, that every single person has something to offer that I don't bring to the table, and also openness to hear from others. I think is the most important attribute that a leader can have to really enable inclusion in an organization. And I mean leader at any level.
Esther, I'd love to hear your thoughts as you think about your career journey.
Yes, I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I wanted to bring the international component to the conversation. I have an immigrant story. I was born in Nigeria in a small town called Anyigba, which you can barely identify on the map, and went through, of course, the typical story of coming here to the United States. Fortunate to have very hardworking parents that really underscored the importance of education and how we can attain the best education in this country, but importantly, not for ourselves, but for other people, right? So the idea of inclusion for me is that whatever you achieve with your own skills and talents are for the benefit of the public good and the global public good. And whether you're from a small town in the middle of nowhere in another country, or a small town here in the United States, your voice matters. And we need to create forums and spaces and places where those voices are reflected. By nature of having those diverse voices, you bring different kinds of solutions. One, you understand a broader spectrum of the challenges and problems that different communities face. And then you think more creatively around what those solutions ought to be. From a whole variety of perspectives, the people you hire, the kinds of issues that you take on, who you bring together to solve those issues, and ultimately, how do we ensure that the communities are benefiting from the solutions that are put forward?
Thank you, Esther. Joni, I'd love to get you to comment, please.
Sure. Well, Esther, I didn't know this about you, that you were from a small town. And I'm from a small town in the United States, from Kansas. I think you can identify it on a map if you're looking for it. But when I was growing up, now 50, or I shouldn't say the number, but too late now. 50 years ago or so, it was at a time and when I had two older brothers, and it was in a time where girls and women were holding positions like secretaries, and maybe not necessarily going beyond high school. But my mother, who was Dorothy from Kansas, as it turns out, my mother, she had this magnet on our refrigerator that said something that I think about in terms of inclusivity. And in the societal perspective, I think about it in terms of how we want to make sure that we're including people who may not otherwise be included normally or typically. And the magnet said, I want my daughter to not grow up to marry a doctor, but to grow up to become one. And little did I know that I would actually grow up to become a doctor, a PhD, in genetics, also in a field, I think, that was largely, largely male dominated, but not exclusively. But certainly in the field of genetics, everyone has probably heard the story of Watson and Crick and Franklin. But maybe less so of the woman who really is credited with a lot of the findings in the early days of the structure of DNA. And so I think that has always stuck with me, and it has then translated into a professional sort of way I think about inclusivity, which is more about making sure you bring the voices in that aren't represented currently, so that you get that inclusivity of thought and perspective. And so with that, I think in the science world, I often think about the understanding of genetics really requires us to have an understanding of a lot of other areas of science, a lot of understanding about how to bring in different populations to understand and learn from them the population genetics and things of that nature. So I think that has always stuck with me, and so it taught me too to just be more about in the field that was male dominated, more listening, take a listening posture, and then when I'm ready to speak, I speak. But other than that, I try to let others speak, but let my actions speak loudly as well.
Rob.
Wow. So first, thank you for allowing me to be on this panel with this wonderful group of women. It's very humbling. I think Janet used that word earlier. My journeys may be different, maybe being a male, right, and thinking about this. And when I first started my career, I know I did not understand inclusion. It probably was not the thing I even thought about, to be very honest. And then I had the benefit, really, of growing up in an environment, through my career where it mattered, right? So whether it be from very strong women that I worked with or males, what I learned was that the power of inclusion in the workforce is very important. Of course, in our daily lives as well, but particularly in the workforce as you think about, the work we do in clinical trials and making sure all those perspectives are there. But also, importantly, is also how you engage a workforce. So, when I think about the people I've worked for, I've always taken a little bit of something from everyone, whether it be a leader or a colleague that, side by side with. And that's inspired me to think about, in the company I work for now, how we engage that workforce, how I personally want to inspire others really to follow that path. There was one of my last boss once said to me, you got to stay strong in the saddle, right? If this really matters, right, then you have to model those behaviors. And when I look at, the workforce that we have in today, 50% of our leaders that are senior VPs or above in our Pfizer research and development are females. On my own leadership team for clinical development, 50% to 80% are females. And it's not by chance in a way. It's because they're the most qualified individuals for those roles. And I feel very inspired every day when I see them and what they do and then how they bring others into the workforce. I have a daughter, right? And my daughter was able to meet Janice recently. And what I want her also to understand is that you can do anything you want, right? And when you meet others that have really kind of moved up that chain of life, you can take a little bit of something from everyone. And so that's what I find inspiring, particularly for, as a person, but then also when I think of my daughter, what I want for her.
Absolutely. Janice, just to close out the personal reflections to start the panel.
Yeah, and I knew I was going to get lost in part of just listening to the panelists, and I did. So maybe just a few reactions to what I heard, and share a little bit about my experience. One, I think we touched on making sure inclusion is really ensuring everyone's voices are heard. But I think as leaders, it's about making sure that they are heard consistently. Right? That consistency is really key. So it's not one time and we heard your voice and you're done. But also, it's important to remember we all have different styles and voices can be heard in different ways, different formats, even in body language. So there's something really important as leaders for us to make sure we foster a consistent, safe environment for those voices to be heard. Metrics and numbers are not going to drive, and they're not going to inspire inclusion. But stories, the stories are not the fairy tale stories I tell my 7-year-old at bedtime, but it's the personal stories we just started to hear, right? And I think stories, those people crave authenticity and transparency. And when I hear those authentic stories, connections are being fostered, trust is being fostered, and that can completely change the way a dialogue is approached. And I think that's really important for us to think about and remember. From my perspective, I immigrated to the US when I was 12. And I remember two things. I did not know the language or the alphabets. And I remember two things vividly from the early months. I really struggled with the flavor of cheese. Now, I'm a huge cheese lover now, but early days, I was really, it was everywhere. And the second one was, boy, it's hard enough. I have a 12-year-old. It's hard enough being a 12-year-old teenage girl and not having the language and the tool, and having to build new tools to build those meaningful connections as a teenager was really hard. And maybe tying to something Joni mentioned, but what I didn't realize, and now reflecting back as part of my career, I had to be an active listener. I had to be very observant in reading people's cues and body language and how they communicate to me. And I'm so grateful for that experience now, so that I can bring those skill set, being active listening and observant, to my day-to-day interactions, because I do think those skill sets allow me to be a more inclusive leader, hopefully in my day-to-day.
Absolutely. It's interesting. So, the title of our panel today is, Inspiring Inclusion, the Power of Pivotal Moments. And, Joni, you shared a really nice anecdote about the magnet, right? And it's not a one-time thing. Obviously, you looked at that magnet across your life. But for me, there are so many moments. I was just reflecting of when did I notice how much inclusion mattered and how much I had the power to inflect inclusion. And I had a personal memory. It was one of my very first jobs where I got to be a part of resume screening and the interviewing process. And so I was doing my thing. I was screening resumes, and a senior person on the teams commented on how there was a common profile for every single person that I was selecting, and it was that they were like me. And I have such gratitude that someone older than, and this was before there was a lot of dialogue about inclusion, called me on it, because it was a real wake-up call to me of, I need to do this differently, because that shouldn't be how it is, right? I definitely have some unconscious bias in terms of how I am selecting